In Angels and Demons, an ancient secret society known as the Illuminati has come back to life in a conspiracy to destroy the Catholic Church. The city of Rome conceals a puzzle that only Harvard symbologist Robert Langdon can solve. Where will Langdon go next? Clues point to the city where his own country was founded, Washington, D.C., and a secret society that may be hidden in plain sight, Freemasonry.
Washington, D.C. will become in the Solomon Key, much like Paris was in the Da Vinci Code, much like Rome was in Angels and Demons. We're going to be hearing a lot about how many of the founding fathers, George Washington, Paul Revere, Benjamin Franklin, happened to be Freemasons. People are going to be wondering, what is this all about, and how come our history books don't tell this history?
Some conspiracy thinkers believe that the Illuminati became deadlier than ever by infiltrating Freemasonry, where they plotted conspiracies that helped launch communism and even the French Revolution. Could Freemasonry possibly be behind these so-called conspiracies? Is the Vatican bank scandal the most recent evidence of the secret society's power? Do the Freemasons have the power to bring a government to its knees? In Italy in 1982, an international banking scandal exposed the Vatican and the secret P2 Lodge of the Italian Freemasons as part of a complex web of fraud and intrigue. By the time it was over, one man, Italian banker Roberto Calvi, was found dead, and Opus Dei, the powerful Catholic secret society, was suspected. And even the death of Pope John Paul I became part of the plot. Today, Calvi's death remains an unsolved mystery, and there are some who believe John Paul, who served only 33 days as Pope, was murdered to keep him from going public about the scandal.
The Vatican bank scandal that was uncovered in 1978 seemed to have been an alliance between certain Vatican authorities, this criminal conspiracy masquerading as a Masonic lodge known as P2, and several people within the church who may not have been criminals but objected to some of the doctrines that Pope John Paul I was about to introduce to Catholicism. There was a rumor that he was going to allow birth control, for example, and the mafia.
Several government leaders who were members of the P2 Lodge resigned in disgrace, and the Italian government collapsed.
The P2 group used Freemasonry in very much the same way that the Illuminati used Freemasonry. They use it as a secret means of building a criminal enterprise. They use the handshakes, they use the mutual obligations and trust in order to further an agenda that had absolutely nothing to do with Freemasonry.
Events like the Vatican bank scandal feed into modern conspiracy theories, based on the idea that a secret brotherhood in control of the world's wealth and power is plotting a new world order. Freemasonry and the Illuminati are often rumored to be involved, its leaders covertly operating such organizations as the World Bank, the United Nations, and the CIA.
New World Order has the common meaning of a plot to essentially take over the world on behalf of some shadowy group of string pullers, sometimes identified with Satan, sometimes identified with the super rich.
There's such a massive amount of material from the lunatic fringe on that one could be extremely confused.
Most New World Order conspiracy theories have what might be called the usual suspects: the Jesuits, the Masons, the Anti-Defamation League, the Trilateral Commission, the Rockefeller family.
The Rothschilds certainly are always being accused of being the proponents of the New World Order.
The religious version of New World Order conspiracy theories, the best known of which is Pat Robertson's, argues that the New World Order is in fact the run-up to the global takeover by the Antichrist.
Conspiracists believe they have ample evidence that the world's most powerful people are orchestrating events. Are Freemasons part of the plot? Although modern Freemasonry is one of the world's most prominent charitable organizations, conspiracy theories allegedly involving the Illuminati and Freemasons seem to be linked to almost every event in history. from the French Revolution to the so-called hidden symbolism in George W. Bush's inauguration. The story of Freemasonry, the oldest, biggest, and most misunderstood secret society, is as provocative as any Dan Brown thriller. It germinates in ancient occult mysteries, emerges during Europe's Middle Ages, and then travels across an ocean to take root in a new world called America. Many suspect that the story grows bigger and stronger every day.
The Illuminati were founded in 1776 in Bavaria by a Jesuit professor from the University of Ingolstadt named Adam Weishaupt. Their influence was very widely spread through their connection with Freemasonry.
The social background of people who were drawn to the Illuminati was very similar to the largely middle-class social background of Masons. There was a desire to maintain secrecy because, after all, the ideas about political liberalization were dangerous ideas, at least in the eyes of absolutist governments.
Although Weishaupt's Illuminati lasted less than a decade before it was wiped out by the Church, Freemasonry became an ideal underground vehicle for its survival. Well established in the late 18th century, the Masons had lodges throughout Europe. Their members were usually a community's leading citizens. The secret society nature of the two groups and their linkage gave rise to what some scholars call the myth of the Illuminati, that it continues to influence world events today.
The irritating thing about the Illuminati myth, as opposed to the Illuminati reality, is that it's advanced as though it's a key to understanding history, when in fact it does no such thing.
Freemasonry has been attached to many of these conspiracy notions, primarily because the society has no centralized structure. Each lodge is independent, the only common thread between them, tradition and ritual.
Within Masonry, there is no central body that determines law for each lodge and each country and each locale, so that these kind of subversives can go in and grab the attention of individuals without a central authority saying, no, you're violating doctrine.
At the time of Freemasonry's popularity in Europe in the 18th century, fashionable society was fascinated by the idea of recovering the secret wisdom of ancient masters like the Egyptians. There were few other sects whose membership was as coveted as the Freemasons.
To think about Freemasonry properly, go all the way back to ancient Egypt. There are groups of people who are stonecutters and pyramid builders, and their knowledge is incredible and is a secret body of knowledge. It's like a powerful body of trade secrets. And imagine the power in a 7,000-year-old society of understanding geometry. Now, it's not surprising that 7,000 years ago, that secret knowledge would be mixed in with religious belief, with magic, with alchemy, with all sorts of other forces.
Many Freemasons supported the Enlightenment philosophy of independence raging across Europe in the 17th century, and they had every reason to protect their secrets.
Think about it. You were dealing in Europe in countries where you had an absolutist monarchy, you had an absolutist church, and where anybody who would dissent, could basically lose his or her life. Then you had these Freemasons coming together and thinking about new ideas, stating, why should one claim a divine right to rule in an absolutist fashion? Or why should one claim that only they have the truth? So it had to be secretive because you were dealing with things that could cost your life.
As an organization, Freemasonry most likely originated with the medieval stonemasons who carved the great cathedrals. Because they worked on massive projects that required years to complete, they formed lodges that served as places of mutual protection and housing. As cathedral building and stonemasonry declined, non- or free Masons were allowed into the lodges. They became more of an elite social club.
People were offered the opportunity of a mythical kind of mysterious group. They could discuss ideas that publicly they really weren't allowed or encouraged to discuss at all, with people who were sworn to protect their privacy and keep them from harm.
As more speculative Freemasons joined the ranks, they retained the group's occult beliefs, which taught an overt meaning to the uninitiated, but another secret meaning to those who advanced higher. Freemasons were willing to risk death for their beliefs. Exactly what was this dangerous secret knowledge? Linked to the past with its secret wisdom, joined to the future with its Enlightenment ideas, and woven by its deep sense of brotherhood, Freemasonry spread quickly throughout Europe and America. The first official Grand Lodge of England was formed in 1717, and by 1730 the first lodge was established in the American colonies. Freemasonry membership has grown with the country, at its height in the 1960s, numbering over 4 million in the United States. Today, it remains a part of the fabric of American culture. What is it about this secret society that has such enduring appeal?
Freemasonry is really a fraternity, and it is based on the individual. I think the name says it all, Freemason. So there's the concept of freedom, that is freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of association, the freedom of the individual. And then you use that to be a builder of a better family, of the community, of the world in which you live.
A Freemason can travel anywhere in the world and not feel that he is a stranger. The fraternity will welcome him with open arms.
We have Masons who come from countries that are literally at war with one another, yet they meet on the level. There's a level of trust among themselves when they meet in lodges, because they're all brothers, and they know that each one of them has gone through a similar experience.
In practice, Freemasonry has changed little from its original central traditions. Many of these were based on legends involving the secret knowledge of the stone-cutting masons who built the Temple of King Solomon in Jerusalem in 850 BC. Simple masonry tools such as the square, compass, and level illustrate universal truths and serve as guiding moralistic symbols.
In Masonry, the reason that temple is so important because it is considered the first temple to be erected to the monotheistic God in the Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions. So in Masonry, we're talking about building your temple within to become a magnificent person, you know, get the diamond that is the divine spark out of you that is buried inside, build it up. And then in so doing, you go out there and build a better world.
A Mason is bound by a strict oath to build his life and character with the same care and precision that stonemasons used to construct the Temple of Solomon.
Freemason's oath is essentially to guard the secrets of the society, and it's criticized by outsiders because it involves violent penalties for disobedience or revealing the secrets. Having one's throat slit or one's head cut off, or all of these things that probably never really happened, or if they did, they were very rare.
Obviously, if you take them out of context and you look at them literally and say, oh my God, what is this? They're really allegorical.
Masons do not invite a man to join. He must apply, and usually does so through a friend who is already a Mason. A candidate is evaluated on his personal merits, not his political or religious affiliation.
You have your own belief. Masonry will never, never interfere with your religion, the allegiance that you owe to your country. This is very important, and will never interfere with your politics. And that is why you'll find in a Masonic lodge people of various political persuasions, but who could meet on the level.
After being accepted, he joins a Blue Lodge, the basic and most widespread organization of Masonry.
It's within a lodge that Masons do their work. There are two streams in Masonry for the higher degrees. One is called York Rite, and the other one is called Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite. In reality, these degrees, although larger in number, they do only one thing, is deepen the knowledge and the dissection of the first 3 degrees.
In the Blue Lodge, there are 3 degrees that a Mason can attain: the Entered Apprentice, the Fellow Craft, and the Master Mason.
In the Entered Apprentice degree, the candidate goes through a ritualistic ceremony, which is designed to make him realize that he is basically starting a new life, going down a new path. And the focus of the Entered Apprentice degree is oneself. It's to start digging deeper into yourself, know thyself. The second degree, the Fellowcraft degree, is much more intellectual. It urges the Mason to pursue knowledge in the arts and sciences. Very important, because this is what builds the mind and gives you the tools so you can go out there and make a difference in the world as a free Mason.
The third and final degree in Masonry teaches that a Mason can never master life until he has mastered death. The candidate undergoes a ceremony of symbolic death and rebirth based upon the legend of Hiram Abiff, the master architect of Solomon's temple.
The first Mason was Hiram Abiff. Hiram was also the first martyr of Masonry. He was slain by workers who sought to capture his secrets, and rather than revealing them, he died in support of those secrets.
The knowledge was power. The three enemies who want to extract that knowledge and attacked him, and he was killed. This is part of the ceremony to remind the Master Mason that in reality, tyranny, fanaticism, and ignorance are three enemies out there always trying to take the true knowledge away from the people, to keep them in darkness, to keep them subdued.
The ceremony of the third degree calls for the candidate to simulate Hiram Abiff's murder. With his flesh allegorically rotting off his bones, the Master Mason is required to use a grip called the lion's paw. The candidate is immediately raised to his feet or resurrected. From the hand of a trusted brother, the candidate is raised to a higher level of spiritual understanding, and with the strength so gained, he becomes a better man. The Mason apron symbolizes the initiate's progress through the ranks.
This is a white leather apron. It is the symbol of the entered apprentice. It is white as a symbol of innocence. And throughout the civilized world where Masonry exists, this is the apron of the initiate.
The Hiram Abiff legend conveyed the framework of the Brotherhood's symbolic purpose.
In Masonry, we use symbols having to do with the concept of building. And symbols are very important. Why? Because a symbol is something that one can interpret in many ways.
One of the most important Masonic symbols is the compass, which reflects the individual and his sense of boundary and proportion.
How big the compasses are, the larger the circle is, depends on yourself. The idea is that you should never go beyond the circle. You keep your desires and passions within due bounds.
Another is the square, a symbol of virtue. Many familiar expressions came from this symbol.
In English, terms came like to be on the square, a square deal. You know, if someone is doing something that is not quite right, say they're cutting corners because they're not squaring them.
Other symbols include the plum, which stands for moral rectitude, and the level, which means treating all people as equals.
Throughout the world in Masonry, we say we meet on the level, we act by the plum, and we part on the square.
For the Freemason, the lodge is a sacred meeting place full of meaningful allegorical symbols.
You will find automatically some things that you don't find in other places. You find two columns, and you will notice that on the top of one column is the terrestrial globe, and on top of the other one is the celestial globe. To remind the person that we are constantly living in this duality between the heavens and the earth, and that wisdom is always the ability to put these at a state of equilibrium. Below as above, above as below. You'll also find a checkered floor. This is reflective of darkness and light. And that is, in life, a person is constantly going through dark period and light period. This is the nature of the world in which we live.
To Freemasons, the symbols and allegories of the craft are about building a better human being for society. So why do so many conspiracy thinkers believe they have more sinister implications? The selectiveness of Freemasonry, as well as its wealth of symbols and secret ceremonies, plays into many of the notions of modern conspiracy theories.
Freemasonry has essentially been accused of being the force behind communism, the force behind the Great Depression, the force behind the world wars, the force behind the United Nations, the force behind the appearance of the Masonic symbols on the dollar bill.
Are Freemasons plotting to take over the world behind the closed doors of the lodge? To conspiracy thinkers, world events are the unfolding design of global power brokers. Both Freemasonry and the defunct Illuminati have been accused of serving as conduits to dark forces the rest of us can only imagine.
People make these accusations because I don't think they understand the purpose of a secret society. It's like a special interest group. You know, it's like people who discuss model airplanes. One of the conditions for joining that group is an interest in model airplanes. Why would you want a bibliophile in that group? The idea that things occur in secret that there are oaths taken, that there are perhaps hidden agendas being manipulated, scare people.
Masons are out there plotting to take over the world, secret society, you name it. Honestly, this is all baloney.
Some of the negative associations Freemasonry has acquired were unintentionally created by the writings of Albert Pike, one of the most influential American Masons. His book, Morals and Dogma, traced Freemasonry to ancient mystical practices and symbols.
Albert Pike is often seen as the great spokesman for American Freemasonry, and his book, particularly Morals and Dogma, is often referred to by anti-Masons. And I think it's important to recognize that this is not an official Masonic publication. This is Albert Pike's views of things.
Pike wrote at a time when Freemasonry was deeply entrenched in American society. Some conspiracy thinkers would have us believe that the very founding of America was part of the Freemason conspiracy. Could they be right? Many early American heroes like Paul Revere, Ben Franklin, and George Washington were Freemasons. Is it any wonder that conspiracy thinkers believe that the forming of America itself was a Freemason plot? They point to the dollar bill as proof.
The dollar bill, as it exists today on the back, has a symbol which is widely regarded as Masonic. On the reverse, here you have the unfinished pyramid, and at the top you have the all-seeing eye, meant to symbolize the all-seeing eye of God, a providence upon the nation. This is widely regarded as a Masonic symbol, and in fact, by 1800 or so, almost anyone in America would have seen this as a Masonic symbol.
The first time that the all-seeing eye appeared in public actually was on the dollar bill in 1935. Henry Wallace, a Freemason, suggested it to Franklin Roosevelt, a Freemason, and it was added to the dollar bill.
The term underneath the all-seeing eye translates into a new order for the ages, which fit the Founding Fathers' belief that they were building a model for the rest of the world.
Many people who are very concerned with the original values upon which America was founded felt that Roosevelt, by putting the seal on the dollar bill, was proclaiming a kind of new order of the ages, a form of socialism to evolve into communism that would somehow or other establish this total state that they and many others greatly fear.
Americans were creating a new kind of society a new sort of government which ideally was supposed to last through the ages and to be a model for the rest of the world. So in that sense, Masonry would have seen itself as part of that endeavor.
You look at the pyramid, and under the pyramid you have Novus Ordo Seclorum, in Latin, new order for the ages. Well, it's not a conspiracy. This is not a taking over the world. What it means is that the founders were establishing a new order. The new order is based on three pillars: individual freedom, rule of the people, rule of the law. And they chose a pyramid to state that building this new order, which we call democracy today, is a very difficult thing.
Many claim that the all-seeing eye indicates that America was built upon a relationship with God.
It is really to highlight and stress freedom of conscience. That is, if you're a Jew, Christian, Muslim, a monotheist, you can interpret that as the all-seeing God, you know, omnipotent, omnipresent. If you're a Buddhist, this could be the source of inner light. This could be the third eye of wisdom. You can interpret it any way you want.
It reminds us of who we are as a nation, what our purpose is, and what protections are enshrined in our laws.
For conspiracy thinkers, the dollar bill is only the tip of the Freemason Illuminati evidence in the designing of the new America. The very blueprint of Washington, D.C. is further proof.
There's absolutely no other capital city in the world that was designed the way Washington, D.C. was. Washington, D.C. was designed on a map with an intention that it should reflect through symbolism the ideals and principles of the great American experiment and what the founding fathers had in mind.
George Washington insisted that the district be constructed in the shape of a square. Could the shape itself be a symbol?
The square in Masonry is a very powerful symbol. It's a symbol of virtue and wisdom. And the idea was that this new form of government, this new order, was going to operate on the square. Transparency, straightforwardness, people would know how decisions would be made. In fact, the cornerstones of the district were all laid in Masonic ceremonies.
The U.S. Capitol building, which has a Masonic cornerstone laying, the White House, which has a Masonic cornerstone laying, and the Washington Monument, which is actually has much closer connections with Masonry itself.
The city was divided into 4 quadrants: northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast. At the center is the Capitol. The streets are numbered and alphabetized, a scientific, rational way of designing the city.
And that is to send another very important message, is that the new order was not going to rely on religion to govern the affairs of the people as did the old. This new order will rely on reason and the scientific method.
Some people see the geographic layout of Washington as being some sort of Masonic code for things. And it is true that the buildings of Washington often had Masonic ceremonies to set them off. But the larger setting of Washington, D.C. is set up more as a symbolic representation of the government. The center is Capitol Hill, the United States Capitol, and everything radiates out from there. So that's the symbolism of Washington, it seems to me, not some sort of hidden Masonic symbolism.
But some Masons believe that the building of the original Capitol and other key buildings deliberately took 7 years to build.
So did the Supreme Court. So did the Lincoln Memorial. 7 years. Now that could be pure coincidence, but number 7 is essential to Masonry because the Temple of King Solomon, according to the Bible, was built in 7 years.
The only known Mason involved in planning the city was George Washington. But a non-Mason, Thomas Jefferson, was largely in charge of the project. Still, many conspiracists see a Freemason power grid for dark forces embedded in the city's layout.
Some of the theories out there by some of these conspiracy theorists that there are hidden symbols that are, you know, for the devil or whatever it is, satanic, I mean, that's all baloney.
Spatial placement of monuments is a way of making accessible sources of virtually supernatural power, and that strikes me as a fantasy and also essentially an entirely untestable proposition.
One example of Freemasonry symbolism is the Washington Monument, which was designed as a tribute to the first president by architect Robert Mills.
The obelisk is a beam of light. It represents the concept of diversity of the 7 colors of the spectrum within the unity of light. And George Washington brought 13 diverse colonies together to form the United States. And this is why Robert Mills, who was a Freemason and who was the architect, wanted not only to honor George Washington by having the obelisk, but it was also immortalizing the motto of our country, E pluribus unum, out of many, one.
The Founding Fathers' involvement in Freemasonry was the source of many conspiracy theories. Is Masonic symbolism in Washington more than meets the eye? Freemasonry arrived in America with the ideas of the European Enlightenment. With the first lodge established in the colonies in 1730, Freemasonry attracted leading figures of the American Enlightenment.
And it draws upon all these set of ideas which are central to the Enlightenment, where you don't have to have a government watching out to make certain that people are going to destroy each other and ruin each other. The Enlightenment said people can get along.
Masonic values are essentially Enlightenment values. Freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of association, the idea that people flourish best with intellectual and spiritual freedom. This helps to explain the growth of Freemasonry and Enlightenment at the same time.
Enlightenment values were expressed in a flood of pamphlets. John Locke and Thomas Paine argued that the people were inherently possessed of the ability to govern themselves. In a world ruled by absolute monarchies, these were revolutionary ideas. Freemasonry gave colonists their first opportunity to exercise self-governance.
People could discuss ideas openly that they were forbidden to discuss within their society. There was an equality in the lodge that allowed for each person to become a leader as well as a member. There was a general sense of tolerance, of universal brotherhood, of all of the values that were so desired by these Enlightenment people.
Freemasonry avoided any religious association, welcoming anyone as long as they believed in a supreme being.
People who felt that the divinity was very real, that it was the creator God, but perhaps had stepped back and left things to run as they were going to run, with more hands-off attitude, were allowed to express and to build that faith within the Masonic lodges.
The colonial period was not a good time for organized religion. Out of the 4 million people living in America in 1790, less than 10% belonged to a congregation.
In some ways, people have talked about Masonry as being even a kind of surrogate religion. And I think there's some element of truth in there, in that American churches are increasingly moving away from rituals, moving away from the sort of structures which had shaped, Christianity for centuries and centuries.
Colonial Freemasons had very little interest in the mystical elements of Freemasonry. They were more interested in the status it conveyed. In the mid-18th century, Freemasonry membership gradually became identified with the movers and shakers of the new country.
Many of the key leaders of the revolution were Masons. Benjamin Franklin, perhaps the key diplomat of the American Revolution, is a Mason. George Washington, who if anybody symbolizes the American Revolution, is also a Mason. Paul Revere, the famous Boston silversmith, who remember rides to warn people that the British troops are coming to Lexington and Concord, becomes the Grand Master of Massachusetts.
Paul Revere, on the night of his famous ride, captured by the British, and the British captain turns out to be a Mason, Paul Revere turns out to be a Mason, and the British captain lets him go after they establish through use of certain words that they're both Masons. And we have these incredible incidents in American history which today we know very little about.
The approaching war created conflicted loyalties, as many Masons supported the monarchy and joined the British forces. And many lodge members were men who would lead the revolution and later the nation.
There are stories saying that all of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Masons. All of the generals of the Continental Army were Masons. That's not true. But it is true that Masons were much more highly concentrated within these groups.
For many Americans torn apart by the war, Freemasonry was the only fraternity that could bring men together despite their political differences.
You have lodges in the Patriots' army, you have lodges in the British army, but there's also a sense in which Masonry goes across enemy lines. There's one case where an American general discovers the equipment of a British lodge, and he sends it back to them rather than holding on to it. And he says, you know, we are enemies in some ways, but yet we are still brothers.
Of the 5 Americans traditionally called the Founding Fathers, Benjamin Franklin, Edmund Randolph, and George Washington were documented members of the fraternity. They participated in the writing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Could Freemasonry have influenced these documents?
There is no question in my mind that when one looks at the history of the United States and how it came to be, looking at the Founding Fathers, the key players, Masonry was definitely an integral part of the life. Now, did they go and sit down and say, you know, because I'm a Mason, I want to do this? No. Masonry really is something that you internalize.
A founding father who used his Freemason identity to network his advancement was Boston-born Benjamin Franklin. From his start as a middle-class printer, he would become America's leading diplomat and statesman and epitomize the values of Freemasonry.
And Franklin is, in some ways, not as well-to-do as some of the people he deals with in the lodge. You know, he's this rising artisan. He's somebody who's moving up, but he's involved in a craft which brings you into contact with ideas. And later on in life, he goes on not only to become the head of Pennsylvania Freemasonry, but then while he's in France during the American Revolution, he's also involved in Freemasonry there. And actually, Benjamin Franklin is the person who escorts Voltaire, one of the great symbols of the Enlightenment. He escorts him into the French Lodge.
America's first president has had more controversy attached to his Freemason involvement than any other early American figure.
Washington joins the Masonic order quite early. He's only 20 years old when he joins, and he's very active in attending ceremonies, public activities which revolve around the Continental Army.
Certainly he wrote about the Enlightenment values that Freemasonry espoused, and he spoke well of Freemasonry. He contrasted them, in fact, with the Illuminati, whom he really hated and feared, and worked to stop whatever influence may have been attributed to them in the design of America. Lodge records indicate that Washington was not a fervent Mason. His attendance was, you know, somewhat minor, but he did believe in their principles and espouse them.
He also allows himself, when he is president, to be painted as a Mason. There's a portrait of him wearing his Masonic jewel and his apron. Washington was a very careful man. The fact that he wanted to have a U.S. Capitol cornerstone laying and that he was willing to present himself as a Freemason in a portrait, I think suggests that it was something significant and powerful for him.
At the laying of the U.S. Capitol cornerstone, Washington wore his Masonic apron. A traditional Masonic ceremony was conducted with hundreds of Masons in procession, dressed in full Masonic regalia. To some, Washington's message was unmistakable.
Well, the symbolism of the cornerstone, I think, is essentially, in some ways, a priestly one, a religious one, because what you're doing is you're connecting a building, everyday physical reality, with a world of values and ideals. So I think in some ways, the Masons are almost the priests of the new republic.
While Freemasonry was firmly weaving itself into the new belief system of America, the Brotherhood was under attack in Europe and creating havoc in France. In 1789, the same year the American Constitution took effect, the French stormed the Bastille and launched their revolution. In Bavaria, Adam Weishaupt had been banished and his Illuminati exterminated. Prominent Americans were divided in their views about Weishaupt and the Illuminati.
The Enlightenment was a vast and far-reaching movement that resulted in, among other things, the American Revolution, the embrace of science, and a whole change that is still going on within society to this day. The Illuminati were a small part of that. They were a very radical group within that tradition, and they sought a violent overthrow of the monarchy and church. While George Washington was a very profound opponent of the Illuminati, Jefferson looked at them more like radical Enlightenment people who had to cloak their teachings in mystery and symbol because of the oppressive religious atmosphere in which they worked and taught.
Two books that became publishing sensations fanned the flames of conspiracy rumors about the Illuminati and Freemasonry.
Proofs of a Conspiracy was a book published in 1798 by a Scotsman, John Robison, and it represented the introduction of the myth of the Illuminati as a catalyst of revolution into the English-speaking world.
John Robison's Proofs of a Conspiracy and the Abbé Barruel's Memoirs of Jacobism were published simultaneously in 1798. Neither one of them knew of the other's work at the time. They spread the myth of this anti-Christian, anti-monarchical society like wildfire. People were very responsive to the idea that something was wrong, something amoral or immoral was taking place. Traditional values were being overthrown and scoffed at, and no one quite understood how it was happening.
After the French Revolution, those who had favored the monarchy tried to find reasons for their defeat.
It was much more comforting for them to feel that the monarchy had been destroyed by some cabal of conspirators, hence the Illuminati theory, so that instead of the revolution being a mass phenomenon, it was the workings of a small, devious, and evil group.
That Freemasons really fomented and caused the French Revolution. That is also baloney. And the reason being, the Grand Master of the Masons of France was the Duc d'Orléans. He was the Duke of Orleans. He was related to the king, Louis XVI. There were Masons on the loyalist side, on the monarchists, and there were Masons who were Republicans.
I believe that the American Revolution was clearly at the best of the Enlightenment. In other words, people who were Freemasons decided to embody those wonderful goals within the laws of a nation. It's one of the reasons I believe that the American experiment is so holy, and I use that word as someone who values that word greatly. The French Revolution, on the other hand, I believe can be traced to an Illuminati conspiracy. The influence of and manipulation of the Masonic lodges by the Illuminati was something that was actually taking place. The violence, the insanity, the bloodbath that is known as the French Revolution was almost the very opposite of the Enlightenment values embodied by the American Revolution.
In the 1790s, there are a lot of religious people in America who are fearful. You've separated church and state, something which is revolutionary. The Illuminati is showing that there are people who are opposed to religion who are attempting to undermine the order of society.
In the early 19th century, American Freemasonry would suffer another deadly blow to its reputation. What became known as the Captain Morgan affair would only confirm suspicions that Freemasonry used its ruthless power to evade justice.
And in 1826, you have an incident that sort of blows it all apart. And what happens is in upstate New York, there is a man who had been a Mason who decides that he wants to publish an expose of the rituals. Now, in itself, this is not an extraordinary thing. Exposés of rituals had gone back all the way to the 1720s in England. What Morgan wanted to do was to expose a whole series of new degrees, which seemed much more sacred.
The Masons tried to prevent the publication of Morgan's book. He was jailed on trumped-up charges, but then mysteriously spirited away.
Actually never seen again publicly. And people differ on what actually happened to him. My belief is that he was killed, not because Masons wanted to do this or the Masons who did this wanted to do this, but because they couldn't figure out what to do with him anymore.
This gave birth to an anti-Masonic party in the United States around 1830, which went wild in taking all of that anti-Masonic, anti-Illuminati hysteria, the flames of which had been fanned 40 years earlier.
Pamphlets against Masonry flooded American communities, and politicians campaigned on the platform that the secret society must be stopped before it destroyed America.
Legislative pressure, all sorts of things, means that Freemasonry plummets. The membership goes down enormously. In some states, Masonry simply goes away. Vermont, Michigan. Masonry simply does not exist anymore.
Its mystique and reputation shattered, Freemasonry was almost wiped out in America. As it slowly regained status, it was a very different kind of secret society, forced to compete with new fraternal organizations that had used it as a model, like the Knights of Columbus and the Odd Fellows. Its once radical ideals had become the American way of life. At the beginning of the 20th century, Freemasonry began developing its current identity as a charitable organization. Americans make up more than half its worldwide membership. The fraternity is thriving, particularly in the former communist countries, which are undergoing their own form of modern enlightenment.
Freemasons here in the United States, working with Freemasons overseas, are building bridges and exchanges. Freemasons from Washington, D.C. working with Freemasons in the Philippines. Muslim and Christians working together to promote peace by building projects and helping people. So it has a very real and powerful impact in today's world. And given the forces of darkness that exist right now around the world, we need as many good people who are willing to go the extra mile. And Masons today are awakening to their central role that they could play in such a world.
Masonry is enormously significant in American history, and it's of continuing interest, I think, because it's really the place where people work out how they feel about their society. What's the meaning of equality? What's the meaning of morality? What's the meaning of brotherhood, of family among people who are not necessarily related by blood? And I think Masonry is about working out those issues.
Despite a lack of new younger members, Freemasonry still retains its mystical appeal.
If people want to join a charitable organization, they can certainly join the United Way. Why do they need this mysterious claptrap with secret uniforms, secret handshakes, secret words? It's because there needs to be a central mystery. That central mystery is a very profound moral and religious and spiritual teaching, which I believe Masonry has. I believe that it can offer it to succeeding generations, and I believe it will.
Freemasonry raises millions of dollars for worthy causes every year, with each lodge undertaking its own work in its community.
Typically what you have are programs that have to do with intellectual growth, social growth, development, ideas that basically Masons will talk about. Some lodges are more socially oriented and more charitable, so they will focus on what is needed in the community. But one thing does not happen is conspiracy.
Most of all, Freemasons are proud of the role they have served in the founding of American values, the building of the country, and the shaping of the American character.
How can that group of people, so diverse, with different opinions, against all odds, the British Empire, yet come together and come up with this great experiment? With all its flaws, it is still a great experiment. If they could do it, what can we learn from them?
Dan Brown's next book will certainly increase awareness and interest in Freemasonry, but it's going to cause a lot of people to want to know about this history, particularly the period of the Founding Fathers, and I think people are really going to get very interested in this.
Is Freemasonry part of a vast global conspiracy out to take over the world?
I don't see Freemasonry as a conspiracy. I don't see it as a secret cabal trying to achieve certain goals. What I see happening is, in a certain sense, democracy is the greatest conspiracy of all, because through democratic means, the world has been changed in incredible ways, and power has been shifted from the formerly powerful to the people. And in that sense, one can imagine the Freemason vision being potently achieved through the practice of democracy.